The lights in the Family Feud studio had never illuminated anything quite like this before. 73-year-old Rose Martinez sat carefully in the contestant's chair, her weathered hands gripping her wooden walker, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the magical world she had watched through a small television screen for the past 15 years. The floral dress she wore was her finest, purchased specifically for this moment by the nursing home staff who had made this impossible dream come true. But what made this moment truly extraordinary wasn't the lights or the cameras or even Steve Harvey himself. It was the fact that Rose Martinez was about to experience something she hadn't felt in over 4 decades, the sensation of being someone's family. Rose had been a resident of Sunset Manor Nursing Home in Bakersfield, California for 42 years. She had arrived there at 31 years old, a young woman with no family, no visitors, and a developmental disability that made independent living impossible. The world had changed dramatically during her decades in institutional care, but Rose's routine had remained constant: breakfast at 7, medications at 9, television in the common room until dinner, and then sleep. Family Feud had become her daily anchor, the 1 hour each day when she felt connected to something joyful and warm. The story of how Rose had ended up at Sunset Manor was one of those tragedies that slipped through society's cracks. Born to teenage parents who couldn't cope with a child with special needs, Rose had been surrendered to the state when she was just 18 months old. She had bounced between foster homes and group facilities throughout her childhood, never staying anywhere long enough to form lasting bonds. By the time she aged out of the foster system, she had learned that attachment was dangerous, that hoping for permanence only led to disappointment. Her developmental disabilities weren't severe, but they were enough to make independent living challenging. She could read at a basic level, could hold simple conversations, could take care of her personal needs, but managing finances, maintaining employment, and navigating the complexities of adult life proved overwhelming. At 31, after a series of failed attempts at assisted living arrangements, Rose had been placed at Sunset Manor, which was supposed to be temporary, while social workers found a more appropriate placement. 42 years later, she was still there. Rose had never missed an episode in 15 years. She would position herself in the same chair every afternoon, memorizing Steve Harvey's expressions, learning the rhythm of the game, developing her own answers to survey questions. The nursing home staff had grown accustomed to hearing Rose talk to the television, cheering for contestants as if they were her own relatives, crying when families lost, celebrating every victory as if it were personal. What the staff didn't know, what no one knew, was that Rose had created an elaborate fantasy around Family Feud. In her mind, Steve Harvey was her family. She had convinced herself that he knew she was watching, that he spoke directly to her through the screen, that somehow, someday, she would get to meet the man who had brought joy to her lonely life for over a decade. Rose had developed routines around the show that gave structure to her otherwise empty days. She would dress nicely every afternoon before the show started, as if Steve Harvey were coming to visit her personally. She would prepare answers to the survey questions in advance, imagining herself at the podium, picturing Steve's reaction to her responses. During commercial breaks, she would have conversations with the television, telling Steve about her day, sharing observations about the other residents, asking him questions she wished he could answer. The nursing home staff had initially been concerned about Rose's attachment to the show, worried that her fantasy relationship with Steve Harvey indicated a disconnection from reality. But over time, they had come to understand that Family Feud was Rose's lifeline, the thing that kept her engaged with the world beyond Sunset Manor's walls. It gave her something to look forward to, something to discuss with other residents, something that made her feel connected to the larger world. The opportunity had come through a local television station's community outreach program called Dreams Come True. Every month, they selected one deserving person from the community and helped them achieve something special. When the nursing home staff had submitted Rose's story explaining her devotion to Family Feud and her complete isolation, the station had been moved to action. They had contacted the show's producers, explaining Rose's situation, and somehow, miraculously, arrangements had been made. The process had taken months of coordination. The show's producers had been initially hesitant about including someone with Rose's background, unsure how to incorporate a nursing home resident with no family into their family-based format. But when they had learned more about Rose's story, about her 15-year devotion to the show, about her complete isolation, they had been moved to create something unprecedented. But Rose wasn't competing with her own family because she didn't have one. Instead, the producers had created something unprecedented: Rose would be the honorary family member for another contestant family, the Williams family from Ohio, who had graciously agreed to include her in their appearance. It was an unusual arrangement, but everyone involved understood that this was about more than television. This was about giving one lonely woman a moment of connection that she would treasure for the rest of her life. The Williams family had been carefully selected for their warmth and inclusiveness. When the producers had explained Rose's situation and asked if they would be willing to include her as an honorary family member, they hadn't hesitated for a moment. "Of course," Mrs. Williams had said. "Everyone deserves to have family, even if it's just for one day." The morning of the taping, Rose had been too excited to eat breakfast. The nursing home staff had helped her dress, had done her hair in a style that made her feel beautiful, had given her a small bouquet of flowers to carry as a good luck charm. During the drive to Los Angeles, Rose had chattered constantly about Steve Harvey, sharing stories about episodes she remembered, predicting what he would say, describing the conversations she imagined having with him. "Do you think he'll remember me?" Rose had asked the nursing home administrator, who had accompanied her. "I've been watching him for so long I feel like we know each other." The administrator had smiled gently, not wanting to dampen Rose's excitement but also not wanting to raise unrealistic expectations. "I think Steve Harvey is going to be very happy to meet you, Rose. You're going to make his day just as much as he's going to make yours." Now, sitting in the Family Feud studio, Rose was experiencing sensory overload in the most wonderful way. The lights were brighter than anything she had ever seen, the audience energy more electric than she had imagined, and Steve Harvey, her Steve Harvey, was more magnificent in person than 15 years of television had prepared her for. During the pre-show warm-up, Steve had been told about Rose's story, about her decades of loyalty to the show, about the fact that she had no family but had chosen the Family Feud family as her own. When he spotted her sitting with the Williams family, using her walker and beaming with excitement, something in his expression had shifted from professional charm to genuine warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve had announced to the studio audience, "we have someone very special with us today. Miss Rose Martinez has been watching Family Feud for 15 years, and today is her first time being part of our Family Feud family in person." The audience had applauded enthusiastically, but Rose had barely heard them. She was staring at Steve Harvey with the kind of wonder that comes from a dream becoming reality, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Steve had approached her during the break, kneeling down beside her chair so they could speak at eye level. "Miss Rose," he had said gently, "how are you feeling today?" "Like I'm home," Rose had whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've been watching you for so long, Steve. You feel like family to me." The words had hit Steve harder than he had expected. In that moment, looking at this elderly woman who had found family in a television show, who had spent decades in institutional care with no visitors, no connections, no one to call her own, Steve Harvey had felt something shift in his understanding of what Family Feud really meant to people. "Tell me about watching the show," Steve had said, settling into a chair beside her. "What's your favorite part?" Rose's eyes had lit up. "I love watching the families hug each other when they win. I love how you make everyone feel special, even when they give silly answers. I love how you always seem to know exactly what to say to make people feel better." Steve had listened intently, recognizing in Rose's words the kind of deep observation that comes from years of careful attention. "And what do you do during commercial breaks?" he had asked, curious about her viewing experience. "I talk to you," Rose had said simply. "I tell you about my day, and I pretend you can hear me. Sometimes I give you advice about the families, like when someone seems nervous or scared." The admission had touched something deep in Steve's chest. This woman had been having a one-sided relationship with him for 15 years, finding comfort and connection in his television presence. The game had begun with the Williams family facing off against the Rodriguez family from Texas. Rose had been positioned at the end of the Williams family podium, not expected to participate in the actual gameplay but included in every celebration, every moment of support. She had cheered enthusiastically for every correct answer, her joy so pure and infectious that the entire studio had found themselves smiling just watching her experience her dream. Rose's enthusiasm was unlike anything the studio had ever seen. She clapped with her whole body, called out encouragement to both families, and gasped with genuine surprise at unexpected answers. Her reactions were so authentic and joyful that the camera operators found themselves focusing on her almost as much as the actual contestants. But during the third round, something unexpected had happened. The Williams family had been struggling with a particularly difficult category about things that make a house feel like home, and they had turned to Rose for help, asking if she had any ideas. Rose had looked at Steve, then at the board, then back at Steve with an expression of such hope and longing that everyone in the studio had felt it. "Can I answer?" she had asked, her voice barely audible. Steve had looked at the Williams family, who had immediately nodded their encouragement, then back at Rose. "What do you think, Miss Rose? What makes a house feel like home?" Rose had thought for a moment, her eyes distant as if she were remembering something from long ago. "People who are happy to see you," she had said simply. The answer wasn't on the board, but something about the way Rose had said it, with such yearning and such truth, had made the studio fall silent. Steve had looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read, and then he had done something that broke every game show protocol. He had set down his cards and approached Rose's chair. "Miss Rose," he had said, his voice different now, stripped of all performance. "Can I ask you something personal?" Rose had nodded, still staring at him with complete trust. "When was the last time someone was happy to see you?" The question had hung in the air like a weight. Rose had looked down at her hands, then back up at Steve, and when she spoke, her voice was so quiet that the microphones barely picked it up. "I can't remember," she had whispered. The admission had hit the studio like a physical blow. The audience had fallen completely silent, the Williams family had looked stricken, and even the camera operators had found themselves wiping their eyes. Steve had knelt down beside Rose's chair, taking her weathered hands in his. "Miss Rose," he had said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know something. I am happy to see you. Everyone in this studio is happy to see you. You've been part of our Family Feud family for 15 years, and now we finally get to meet you in person." Rose had started crying then, not the quiet tears of an elderly woman, but the overwhelming sobs of someone who had been carrying loneliness for so long that kindness felt like a miracle. "I don't have anybody," she had managed to say through her tears. "I watch you every day because you feel like the only family I have. When you smile at the camera, I pretend you're smiling at me." Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of episodes, had met countless contestants, had witnessed every possible emotion that a game show could generate. But in that moment, holding the hands of a 73-year-old woman who had found family in his television presence, he had felt something that transcended entertainment entirely. "Miss Rose," he had said, and now his own voice was breaking, "would you do me the honor of being my television grandma?" Rose had looked at him with complete bewilderment, as if the words didn't make sense. "What does that mean?" she had asked. "It means," Steve had said, removing his suit jacket and gently draping it around Rose's shoulders, "that you're not alone anymore. It means that every episode we tape from now on, we're going to remember that Miss Rose is watching, and we're going to save a seat for you whenever you want to visit us." Rose had looked down at the jacket, which was enormous on her small frame, then back at Steve with an expression of wonder. "You want me to be your grandma?" "I would be honored," Steve had said simply. The audience had erupted then, not in typical game show applause but in something deeper, something that recognized the sacred nature of what they were witnessing. People were standing, crying, celebrating the moment when loneliness was officially ended by an act of deliberate kindness. But Steve wasn't finished. He had turned to address the entire studio, his arm around Rose's shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," he had announced, "Miss Rose has been part of our family for 15 years, but she's been watching from a distance. Today we're making it official. From now on, Rose Martinez is the official grandmother of Family Feud." He had looked down at Rose, who was clutching his jacket and staring at him as if he were a miracle. "Miss Rose, I want you to know that you have a family now. Not just me, but everyone here, everyone watching at home, everyone who understands that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to show up for each other." Rose had tried to speak but couldn't find words. Instead, she had reached up and touched Steve's face with her weathered hand, a gesture so tender and grateful that it had broken something inside everyone watching. "Thank you for letting me belong somewhere," she had finally managed to whisper. The game had continued, but it had been transformed. Both families had played not for themselves but for Rose, celebrating every point as if it were a gift to their new grandmother. Rose had answered 2 more questions during the episode, both times providing responses that weren't on the board but were so filled with wisdom and heart that they became the most memorable moments of the show. When Steve had asked about things that make you rich, Rose had answered, "Having someone remember your name." When he had asked about things worth waiting for, she had said, "Finding out you matter." By the end of the taping, Rose had become the star of the show without trying, without performing, simply by being authentically herself and allowing others to see her loneliness and her hope. But the real magic had happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Steve had approached Rose one final time, pulling up a chair beside her so they could talk privately. "Miss Rose," he had said, "I meant what I said about being family. I want to give you my personal phone number, and I want you to call me whenever you need to talk to your grandson." Rose had looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You really want to be my family?" "I really do," Steve had said. "And I want to visit you at Sunset Manor. I want to meet your friends there, and I want them to know that Rose Martinez has family who loves her." The promise hadn't been made lightly, and it hadn't been forgotten. 3 weeks later, Steve Harvey had made an unannounced visit to Sunset Manor, arriving with flowers, gifts, and a promise to return regularly. The nursing home staff had been stunned, the residents had been thrilled, and Rose had experienced something she had never known in her 73 years, the feeling of being claimed, chosen, valued by someone who didn't have to love her but decided to anyway. Steve's visit to Sunset Manor had been transformative for the entire facility. He had spent hours talking with residents, learning their stories, bringing attention to a population that society often forgets. He had arranged for the show to make regular donations to improve the facility's programming, and he had committed to visiting Rose every few months. The episode had aired 2 months later and had become one of the most watched and most shared Family Feud episodes in history. Viewers had been moved not just by Rose's story, but by Steve's response to it, by his willingness to turn a television appearance into a real relationship, a game show moment into a life-changing commitment. Rose's life at Sunset Manor had been transformed. Other residents had begun joining her for Family Feud viewings, and the show had become a community event. The nursing home had received donations from viewers who had been moved by Rose's story, allowing them to improve programming and activities for all residents. But the most important change had been in Rose herself. She no longer watched Family Feud as a lonely woman imagining connection. She watched it as someone's television grandma, secure in the knowledge that Steve Harvey really did think of her during every taping, that her chair really was being saved, that her family really did exist. Steve Harvey had learned something profound from Rose about the power of chosen family, about the responsibility that comes with being welcomed into someone's life, about the way genuine connection can transform not just individuals but entire communities. He had discovered that sometimes the most important role you can play isn't entertainer or host, but simply family member to someone who needs to belong. Rose Martinez had found her family at 73 years old. Not through blood or marriage or traditional means, but through the simple act of being seen, valued, and chosen by someone who understood that love is always a choice, and the best families are the ones we create through deliberate acts of inclusion and care. The jacket that Steve had given Rose hung in her room at Sunset Manor, too big for her to wear but perfect as a symbol of belonging. And every afternoon at 3 o'clock when Family Feud began, Rose would touch that jacket and smile, knowing that somewhere in Los Angeles, Steve Harvey was thinking of his television grandma and saving her seat in the family she had finally found. Because that's what love looks like when it chooses to show up. That's what family sounds like when it says you belong here. And that's what happens when loneliness meets kindness and discovers that it was never meant to last forever.